I want to move on to another topic now.
Yeah, sure.
Something more local. I want to talk about Islamophobia in the UK. This has been a big topic that's been talked about recently. So, can we talk about Islamophobia? How would you define Islamophobia? Some people debate the definition or what it means. I don't want to go into that, but how would you define Islamophobia?
Well, I think the name speaks for itself, isn't it? It's a phobia of Islam.
Yes.
So somebody
Yes.
has an unjust and ill-founded fear of Islam and Muslims. And I think basically that has to be the definition, even though I believe the government was supposed to define it and have a whole inquiry about it, but I don't think it got off the ground, did it?
No.
So that's how seriously they take it.
Fine.
I don't even think they have an accepted definition.
Fine.
But I think ultimately it boils down to people's ill-founded fear based on prejudices that they have.
So then, what is the line to, are people allowed to debate, let's say, Islam being in the UK or how it's practiced or how Muslims practice their religion, to then when is considered it being Islamophobic and offensive and derogatory? Where is that line for you?
Well, I think there's no disagreement with regards to the practicing of religions in the UK.
Yeah.
That's a given. Everybody's allowed to. Freedom of religion is a right that everybody has in the personal capacities and things like that. I don't think Muslims or anybody has any issue with people critiquing Islam or critiquing practices of Muslims and things like that. So I mean, it's an open society. It's a free press. And although there are limitations, of course there's limitations in everything. But I think one of the calls that we have been making, and I think is very important, is that any discussion has to be based on civility, has to be a civilized discussion based on merits, based on actual information, and should not be used to stoke tensions in any community. And I think that has to be one of the basis of any discussion that people have.
Fine. Okay. So you think it is legitimate and fine to,
have discussions about Islam, yeah, just like, but then at the same time, it shouldn't be based on misinformation. It shouldn't be based on prejudices. It shouldn't be in a mocking way. It should be based on respect, and it should be based on genuine interest to have that discussion in order to better people's understanding. It shouldn't be with a negative frame of mind, where actually we're just going to have very emotive headlines, which are not based on anything in particular, just to stoke up tensions between communities, isn't it? But also, I think for example, since the 7th of October, there's been a spike in Islamophobic attacks.
Yeah. But do you feel some of that debate is justified? Some people had debating. There are people who lie on two sides of the debate when it's Israel versus, Hamas. Is it fine to debate that?
Yeah, discussing and debating is fine in good nature.
Okay.
But I think when people are obviously carrying out violent attacks, threatening people, when they are committing crimes against Muslims, or have this sense that every Muslim is responsible for every negative act that may happen around the world, and these are clear acts of Islamophobia. They're not acceptable in any shape or form, are they? But if somebody has a concern or wants to discuss the Palestinian position, for example, in this conflict, then that should be discussed. If somebody has a different view, then that should be respected as well.
Okay.
And there's plenty of debate shows which are ongoing, and talk shows, and that's welcome, because if anything, it just broadens our horizon as to what are the different perspectives and how can we are we correct in our perspective, in our view, or not. We can only know that if we speak to other people and see what they have to say about it as well, isn't it? So discussion in a civilized, respectful manner is fine. But any thuggery and right-wing nonsense is not called for at all.
Why do you think we've seen a rise of far-right parties and views in the UK and Europe? We've seen in the EU elections, I think a year or two ago. In the UK, we've seen reform becoming more popular. I guess, why do you think there's been that rise?
I think the issue is that over time there has been a push towards self-interest on an individual basis and also on a national basis. There was a time where people looked towards global status, global economies, working together for the greater good. Obviously, the whole EU project was on that basis, isn't it? Stronger together than apart, but now I think the narrative has changed to say, well, because people are going through very difficult times, as countries, but also as individuals, and so there are people now who just say, well, look, we just need to look after ourselves, and anybody who's not from us, then they're not welcome anymore and things like that. So people have taken it to an extreme,
Yeah.
for sure, because there's no doubt that those who have migrated to this country since the 60s and 70s have contributed to its success tremendously. And then there's some figures who have cottoned on to this, and their voice is heard of everybody else's, isn't it? Like, for example, Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, and these kind of characters. They're experts at kind of gauging the mood in the people and exploiting that for political means and political ends. And so they've cottoned on to the fact that actually people are really struggling.
Yeah.
So let's make a narrative out of that. And so even though the real issue is not migrants coming over to the country,
Yes,
they've deduced that from people's struggles. So people are struggling to make ends meet, and they found an excuse that resonates with people, even though it's not the case.
it was not the case.
Even though it's not the case, but they made a whole political movement out of it.
I wanted to use this time to, I guess, the points that I've heard in the debate, and then I just wanted to hear a response to it. So, in the general election, in the campaign, Nigel Farage said, a growing number of Muslim young people do not subscribe to British values, in fact, despise British values. This was in context to, I think, a number of protests in London soon after the October bombings and lots of people supporting Palestine. Do you think that statement is true or rings truth in any way?
Well, not really, but then it depends on the definition of British values, isn't it? Last time I considered the matter, tolerance, open-mindedness, kindness. These are all British
democracy,
values.
individual liberty.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you feel...
So, well, I mean, how can you contradict those things? Muslims want freedom, don't they? They're happy to have individual freedoms. So to go against British values would be to say, well, I don't want individual freedoms. If that's how it's defined.
I think also in the definition of British values, it was something along the lines of tolerance of other beliefs and values. In general, yes. I guess the question I'll put to you is, would you say some Muslim communities are anti-English or anti-white in such ways, or...
I mean, they can't be. Even if Muslims are, then they're having that attitude is against Islam, because the Prophet ﷺ never taught us that. He never taught us prejudice. In fact, his final sermon, he made that clear that there should be no prejudice between peoples of different colors or different communities and things like that. The Ummah is one, regardless of which background we come from, whichever community we are in. So if Muslims do have that, then it needs to be stamped out. And I would say, look, we have to improve our conduct, our morals, our etiquettes, and our outreach projects. For sure, we have to keep doing that and be the best example of the prophetic behavior that we can possibly be. I think that has to be one of the solutions. But Islam in no way does it encourage that at all. Yeah.
So, but I guess I think a lot of it did, of these issues came soon after the October bombings and lots of protesting happening in London. I guess, could you steelman the case? Why do you think people are actually concerned of Islam or Asian communities in the UK? Or
I'll tell you why.
Yes.
What I think is that there's always a fear of that which you can't control.
Okay.
And there's a fear of that which doesn't bow down to pressures to assimilate right? Assimilate, not integrate. Muslims are totally integrated into the country. They're in every profession, every walk of life, every aspect of the community and the society. They're contributing tremendously. So they're totally integrated. But assimilated means that you remove your identity to take on the identity of somebody else, right? And sometimes, and Islam, I would suggest, is, around the country and around the world, alhamdulillah, the identity of Muslims remains. And sometimes there is a fear of that because, these people are not bowing down to our pressure. They haven't, been totally whitewashed in terms of their mindsets and their thinking. And I think sometimes that leads to, a resistance or a backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's just a lack of education, ignorance. And, in social media, where you have, people who have, there's always, there is always people who have prejudice and ignorance and ill-informed opinions. So when they see someone who is actually voicing their opinions, then that gathers momentum, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
People like Tommy Robinson and people, and those kind of characters, they just kind of galvanize people with that mindset, and then it just snowballs because if what he says, that's what they follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You said Muslims, not Muslims, but communities don't need to assimilate, which is to lose their identity. How would you say Muslims are integrated in society? What do you think? What is the definition of integration?
To be integrated means to be part of the society in a meaningful way.
Okay.
Yeah. And in every way, we could say. But that doesn't mean to say you have to be the same as everybody else. They're not the same things. So, for example, if someone's a doctor, if someone's a lawyer, someone's an engineer, someone's working for the community, paying their taxes, contributing to the community overall, they're homeowners, they're business owners, then I mean, what more integration can there be than that? What's left?
Exactly.
What's left to integrate into?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, not going to the pub doesn't mean you haven't integrated, does it?
Yes.
Simple. So if you look at any part of the society, Muslims have integrated into that. And I think what people struggle with is this idea that despite our integration, we still have an identity of Islam within our personal lives.
Yes.
So even though we're lawyers, even though we're doctors, we still go to prayers.
Yes.
And people think, oh, well, you haven't integrated. No, it's not about integration. That's about a greater purpose that all Muslims have. And they don't lose that purpose. They don't lose that identity, notwithstanding the fact that they've integrated. And so I think the thought process people can't really understand, because a lot of people who don't have religion, they have nothing else in their thought processes. They have nothing else in their minds. And so when somebody does have, they can't really make heads or tails of it, and they haven't really thought it through properly.
Another comment Nigel Farage has said is, I can take you down certain roads in Oldham, and their English is not the main language being spoken. There's people there that actually don't choose or want to speak English, and actually make white communities feel uncomfortable. Do you see that ringing true in any way, or?
I think, look, people should speak English.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think within the Muslim community, there's a big gripe about that. You'll know as well that, most sermons in the mosques are in a different language. And the people who are complaining about that is not Nigel Farage. The Muslims are complaining about that. The younger community are saying, look, we've been here for 40 years. How can it be that we don't have sermons in English?
Yes.
I feel,
yes.
So, it's, I mean, I don't know about the intimidated part or the whole quote I wouldn't agree with. But for sure, the Muslim community and our leaders and our representatives and the community members should speak English. And if there's an older generation that don't speak English, I would suggest that their contribution in society is waning anyway, because they're an older generation. And it wasn't integral for them to speak English in the first place. But to force like a 70-year-old lady, no, you have to start speaking English, it doesn't make any sense. But if you see that contribution that lady has made by, for your argument's sake, she's got a family, her children are educated, her grandchildren are educated, you can't then say, oh, well, she's useless because she can't speak English. She's contributed tremendously to the, in her own way, to the British society by raising children who will be able to speak English, who probably are professionals and who are taxpayers.
Yes, exactly.
They're taxpayers,
Exactly. And they're doing a job and any job is serving the public
Yeah,
in a way.
exactly. Yeah, and there might be valuable community members. So I think, it's a bit misconceived to say that people don't speak English. Those who don't speak English are, I would say, who came very recently, in which case there should be, mechanism and education for them to speak English.
Yes.
Or the older community who, like I said, don't really have a community role anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But the younger community, the leaders, the imams, the scholars, those who are community figures, they must speak English. I agree with that.
Okay. Another thing talked about is you did say, because there's now an inward thinking because of economic issues, that's why maybe there's a rise in Islamophobia. Immigration is also something being talked about, and actually it's now a mainstream political view of not just reform, but even, let's say, Conservative Party and the Labour Party. They feel immigration is too high. Do you think, firstly, I mean, it's not your expertise, but is immigration too high, or do you think it's something used by parties just to settle certain people's views?
Well, at the end of the day, there's a social contract, and the political figures, they need to echo sentiments that will get them votes. And if they don't, then they will not get elected. And if they will not get elected, then they'll be out of a job and they'll be meaningless in their environment. And so I don't really have a view if migration is too high or not, but it doesn't bother me. It's never bothered me. I don't think it has a negative impact at all. But I think those people who are, voicing those concerns and being disproportionate in their representation as to, the levels of migration, they're just doing it for votes, isn't it? And they realize that some people are disgruntled, and there's an argument to be made here. Whether it's right or wrong or actually legitimate is irrelevant. Whether it's genuine or not is totally irrelevant. You've got about 60 million people living in the UK, and we've got probably 0.01% of that are coming in boats, and we can't deal with it. All of a sudden, it's an overarching consideration or policy, but it shouldn't really be the case. But yeah, for sure, it's just a case of pandering to the far right and to secure votes. I don't think it's a genuine issue.
Okay.
Yeah, in other words,
if I take out, let's say, Nigel Farage and Tommy Robertson and maybe the far right, but there is a genuine, decent voting base that maybe do have concerns of integration, or what you may say assimilation, or maybe an uncomfortableness of how multicultural the UK has become, and maybe we're losing British values. I think that's probably maybe a more mainstream view. Do you think any of that does ring true? Or if that is true, maybe what do us as Muslims or the Muslim community need to think about?
I mean, for example, the Muslim community that came over from Pakistan and India in the 60s and 70s, it's not their fault that the British Empire ruled over India. And it's not their fault that Britain colonized half the world and therefore was duty bound to bring people over when they were kicked out or refugees. I mean, what can they do? I mean, you can't undo that. I mean, there's been so many benefits into multicultural society that we're all, reaping the rewards of all of that. I don't think it's a real issue at all. I think that Britain overall is a multicultural society, and it's all the better for that. What we can't do is just go back in time and just whitewash everybody and send everyone back home, because ultimately this is home. But what I would say, Muslims have to be active members of the community. They have to be positive members of the community and a force for good in their localities. We shouldn't be a burden on anybody. Everybody who interacts with Muslims should say, this is the best person I've ever dealt with. Whether it's in a professional capacity, in a personal capacity, as a neighbor, as a friend, as a relative, when they meet a Muslim, they should never feel burdened by that. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons is, people, which contributes to an anti-Muslim narrative, is that such people have never had positive interactions with Muslims. And I think of the recent, following the October the 7th, I think there were riots up north, and there were counter demonstrations, and one of the imams, he went over and spoke to the the far right extremists, hugged them, spoke to them, gave them food, gave them tea, and that's how you break down barriers. Those same people will then not have a far right mentality, will they? So I think there is work to do. If there is there's an ignorance or a lack of education, then we have to take it as a positive obligation upon ourselves to do our best to rectify that, isn't it? Not just firefight, because Muslims are good at firefighting and reacting to situations. And a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, we're talking about what's the reaction, what should it be, but the real question should be, what can we do to be proactive, right? How can we nip this in the bud, as opposed to what should our reaction be to it, right? So how are we supposed to remedy Islamophobia? How are we supposed to remedy the far right extremists and all of these kind of things? I would suggest that there's a few different things we can do. The first is to be, as I said, outward facing in our own mentality. One thing that Muslims do is that we tend to be inward facing. We just want to be in and amongst our own friends, in and amongst our own communities. We don't really want to go out and speak to our neighbors who are from a different background and different community. And what does that do? It creates suspicion, right? So if we outreach, dawah is a massive part of the deen. Outreach to the wider non-Muslim community will be interact and not be afraid, right, of doing that, because we might say, well, if I knock on the door with my jubba topi, they might say, oh, what are you doing here? But if I give them glad tidings and I give them good news, or I give some food, they're not bothered. But that breaks down prejudice then, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So that's on a micro level, but on a general community point of view, we have to have strong identities, and and we have to be good role models, and we need good leaders who can push this forward for us, as opposed to apologizing for everything and reacting to everything and condemning everything. That's fine, but that's not going to resolve anything.